Well, hi, Marjorie. Thank you so much for agreeing to this interview. And before we get started, how are you? How's your morning going?
I'm doing good. I'm hanging in there, and it's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Anna.
Oh, I gotta turn on the transcript real quick. Okay, there we go. Okay, cool. So yeah, I guess without further ado, let's dive into the questions. So, the one thing I guess I'll start with my impression of the book was, well, first I was taken aback, because not only did you take a traumatic history and turn it into a beautiful piece of art, it's the way you went about doing that, through the use of, innovative devices such as documents, integration, text variation, and white space. So I felt an overwhelming sense of appreciation because, you the history that you talked about, was not meant to be uncovered, not meant to be shared. It was definitely meant to be kept a secret. That's Secret War and such. So, could you discuss your composing process with this book in particular?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your comments and just for engaging with the book. I know that the book isn't um, the easiest to start with because of how thick it is for a poetry collection, and that can be somewhat unusual. But for me, I think that working on this collection and really bringing to the surface the issue of Yellow Rain has been a really meaningful experience overall, and working with a lot of the documents too really helped to enrich the process of my writing of a lot of the poems in the collection. So I did a lot of research for this book. It took me almost 10 years to be able to produce the book as it is now. And I spent a lot of those early years, reading through declassified documents, digging through government reports, learning about Yellow Rain, and trying to find out as much as I could about the topic of Yellow Rain as it stood in the archive, particularly in the archive. And I was really interested in knowing what the government was saying about it. I was really interested, particularly in finding out what the declassified documents would reveal and what they wouldn't reveal, because a lot of the stuff that I uncovered was also redacted. And so that meant that there was always going to be a part of the archive of Yellow Rain that would be gone from the written history of this collection and from Yellow Rain itself. So yeah, I spent many years reading through a lot of those documents before I felt ready enough to really write the poems. And when I began to write the poems, I was very conscious of the idea that I had to compartmentalize my process. Otherwise, I don't know that I would have been as organized or been able to approach the work with as much, coherence as I tried to do. Simply because it was just so much. I was inundated myself with information, and the last thing that I wanted to do was to inundate my reader, which I feel like I probably did inundate my reader either way. But I did accumulate over the years numerous binders of papers after papers and just documents and things I knew that somehow had to end up in the collection. And so that's what I worked on years later. After I had done a lot of the reading, I worked really on figuring out which of the documents really needed to be included, and figuring out also ways in which I could then, explore including the documents, maybe not as a poem, but as part of a collage, so various things like that I had to take into consideration. And then the last couple of years I spent really just on writing the poems themselves and just going very hard at it and really focusing and dedicating myself to trying to get these poems written in the time that I had.
Wow, 10 years. Wow. That brings me to my second question, and that has to do with the research. And you did describe your research process, which I can't even fathom, like, having to go through all those archives, those documents, and, obviously running into the redacted ones, the histories that you sadly won't be able to recover. But just a little bit about myself, I'm Cambodian American, and I know Monica Suk, which is really, really interesting because they come from similar backgrounds. We share that tragic history of like the secret war, secret bombings in Southeast Asia. And in an interview with Trisha Park for the podcast, Is It Recess Yet? You mentioned that your parents didn't really tell you much on like the history and that you had to piece together those stories, histories yourself, and that was evident in, you know, your research process. So if you were advising another person, say me, on how to do similar research, what would you say?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yeah, Monica is a good friend of mine. I was lucky to be able to do a reading with her a few weeks back where we had the chance to be in conversation about Yellow Rain. So with, advising a student or any interested writer in pursuing the work of research or figuring out ways to explore the world of docu-poetics, one of the things that I would advise someone to be able to do to start is, there's the age-old approach of having a question in mind, right? And that's often the one of the obvious things that you can do. And for me, I think it really did help, as cliche as it sounds, to start out by saying have a question in mind. I think it really did help me to have something that I was pursuing, or have something that I was working towards, or have a goal that I wanted to try to accomplish through this process. And for me, even if it wasn't in the shape of a question, it was in the shape of a concern that I had, in the shape of a thing that didn't feel right to me, just this notion that something doesn't feel right about Yellow Rain. And the willingness then to trust my gut into it and my intuition and to follow that is often the most hardest thing to do, because throughout the process, you begin to doubt yourself. You begin to say, am I going in the right direction? What am I trying to uncover? This feels hopeless. This feels futile. And so one thing I would advise anyone is that have that question in mind, have that concern in mind, and don't be afraid to follow it as far as you need to go. Obviously, keeping your own safety in mind, but be willing to pursue that wherever it does take you. And the other thing too is one of the things I learned through the process is that you have to also be willing to follow the tangents and the unexpected trajectories that the research might take you into. So be willing to kind of go down those other trajectories as well, even though it might feel like a rabbit hole and you're sort of just continuing to dig and to dig. But for me, I think with Yellow Rain, it really did take me into surprising areas of study that I hadn't or wouldn't have anticipated going into otherwise. So yeah, I'd say be willing to follow the concern or the question or the curiosity that brought you to the work, and then be willing to follow the tangents or the distractions, the obsessions that bring you to it, and see where it leads you. Yeah.
Wow, I really appreciate that. I think that was really, really moving, really just that, not just resilience, but the ability to just continue on until you uncover, you know, what you sought out in the first place. And, you know, like you said, 10 years, that's really, really, I think that's like about the same time it took for my, I guess, dad to like emigrate to the US, which, you know, looking back at it, doesn't sound like a lot, but I guess throughout the process, it can feel really, you know, tedious. And yeah, so I applaud you for that. And I thank you for the advice. And
Yeah. And
speaking of, sorry about that, go
yeah,
ahead.
that's okay. And one thing I would add to that too is that even though I had spent almost 10 years doing this work, at the end of the process, you think that you might, dawn upon a grand answer to whatever the question was that you had. And it may not happen that way. It may not happen that you arrive at that ultimate grand finale of an answer that you were searching for when you started this work, or your answer might shift through the process, or the poems that you thought you would write aren't the poems you actually want to write anymore for the book. And so you just have to be ready to anticipate those possible trajectories within your research and, take them, go with that if that's where your gut is telling you to go. And I think for me, maybe in the end, as much as you might have wanted an answer as in the way that I wanted an answer, it may just be that the book itself can be also part of that answer, whether you find that definitive answer or not. that's whatever you produce out of it is part of the answer that maybe you were looking for all along. And so that's kind of what I have thought about with Yellow Rain. But yeah, just addressing what you were saying about the time that it takes to go into all of this, and hoping to find whatever you're going to find can shift depending on the process that you go through and these surprises that you encounter.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I think that's really wonderful advice, because it is easy to, lose sight of what you had first started off, seeking. So I think the ability to adapt and be flexible with, changing your question or changing the course of your, I guess, research or and such will definitely help with the process. So thank you. And I guess on the topic of, you mentioned docu-poems or docu-poetry, and I think that was the number one thing I found to be common in all the poems I would read from like POC or people or Asian American poets, was that they were uncovering a history that, was meant to be buried. It's not like the other poems that I've read about, nature or other types of genres. It was always specifically about, the hardships that they had to go through, the hardships that they had to deal with the US. And actually, you're one of the few writers I discovered that write about events that I can relate to on a cultural and personal level, similar with Monica. So my question is, can you recall the first time you read a piece from a person of color writer whose story resonated with you? Who was it, and what did that moment do for you?
Yeah, I think for me, there were many, many writers who helped to shape my path as I look back on when I started writing poetry and when I started to discover poets that I felt an affinity with. And there was a poet that I found early on in my time as a writer, and not even when I was like a young child, but much later in my life, maybe undergraduate. And this poet, Honani K. Trask, is a poet who is not only an educator and an activist, but also someone who really advocated and pushed for greater remembrance of the history of colonization that impacted the island of Hawaii. And being from Hawaii as well herself, this was a topic that she wrote about in a lot of her poems, is really wanting to call out that history of colonization. And so for me, when I found her poems, and especially when I found her book, Light in the Crevice Never Seen, I just loved that title, Light in the Crevice Never Seen. And it really spoke to this idea of being invisible, almost in some ways, of being never seen, and yet still having the light that can be the way forward some way, somehow, even if it's just a hint of light. And many of those poems in that book, I love so much. I turn to that book quite a bit sometimes when I'm feeling the need to have that push. But a lot of them are exploring histories of racism and continued histories of racism, and the history of colonization that has impacted the indigenous peoples of Hawaii and other areas in the Pacific Islands too. So reading those poems really, opened up for me a new voice, a new way of thinking about how poetry can be part of reshaping narratives, and poetry can play a role in how we rethink about what narratives can be as they pertain to particular communities of people, and how we can play a role in helping to create those narratives that we, that whatever community we come from demands that it be changed to. And so it's, for me, it really opened up my eyes to how I as a writer can be part of shaping that narrative, of dismantling what the dominant narrative might be saying about who I am and my community, and then being able to have the agency to offer my role in reshaping that narrative.
Wow, yeah, no, I definitely relate so much to that, because part of the reason why I want to be a writer is because, well, aside from Monica, who I discovered, not too long ago, I didn't know any other Cambodian writers who spoke about, the horrors, the tragedies that happened to us. And so I thought, I would be, or I would be one of the voices to, tell our stories and keep traditions and histories alive. But I want to go back to when you said invisible. Invisible really reminded me of, the same interview you had with Trisha Park. And it reminded me of when you said, I have to be twice as good to be given access to be heard. And so, in your opinion, does that seem to be getting better at all? And then what will it take for us as society to give POC writers an equal opportunity to be heard? I'm so sorry about that little message.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, because it's exciting to think about the potential of what this whole area of literature can offer to the larger landscape of literature is the work of POC writers. And what's really exciting for me too is the work of Southeast Asian poets like yourself, and Monica, and poets that come from communities that have not always had that visibility or not always had that access. And for me, it's given me just a burst of inspiration to see, lately, all of the, emerging Vietnamese American poets like Susan Nguyen, Joshua Nguyen, Sophia Terazawa, just to name a couple, people who are writing now and really working towards building careers as writers by publishing. And I think that one of the key things that we have to continue to push towards as writers of color, as writers who haven't always had that access or that visibility, is that we have to publish. We have to keep working at that by continuing to send work out for publication, to put ourselves in competition with other writers so that we have just as much of a fair chance to get published as anyone else does. And going back to what I shared in that interview with Trisha Park, for me, I think that this idea of having to be twice as good is sort of true, even though I wish it wasn't the case, and I wish it wasn't the case that any writer would have to work twice as hard. But for me, as among writers specifically, first of all, as a writer, life is tough as it is, because you're having to hustle and push yourself to get published and to write, and then to be able to survive and make a living at the same time. But then to be a Hmong writer is even more sort of doubling down on this anxiety, because few people know who Hmong people are. And so then you're constantly having to retell yourself to people. You're constantly having to explain your history, or you're constantly having to, again, reoffer the narrative, but your version of that narrative. And so the work can often be twice as much for writers who are not as part of the landscape as writers who are already visible and thriving within the landscape. So I think one of the key things is that we have to continue to publish, we have to continue to write, and we have to continue to support writers, young writers, up and coming emerging writers from all communities. And I'm especially excited to support writers from Southeast Asian communities, like yourself, and from my own community as well, to really nurture these new voices and this next generation who can help continue the work and help to carry it forward, however it happens and in whichever direction it goes.
Yeah, no, the being a writer and making a living thing just stuck so hard with me, because that's the main thing my parents often, lecture me about. What I get, lecture is not the right word, I guess, just talk to me about, because they emigrated here, they came with like just the clothes on their back. So, and then they built a foundation for me, that way I can go off and create a future for myself here and be successful. So when they heard I was going into writing, they were a little scared. But I think now that you mentioned that, it just made me think about how important the telling is. Like, I know it's, important to be successful and make a living out of your, I guess, profession, but storytelling, keeping traditions alive, keeping stories alive goes a really, really long way. And yeah, I definitely agree. Nurturing, young writers, new
Mhm.
voices is just something that we have to continue to do. And yes, the publishing, I will get to that for sure. And I will continue to, look past the 100 rejections and look at the one acceptance. But yes.
Yeah, and actually I want to just add, I can, if it's okay, I can add a little
Yes,
bit more
yes.
to that. But yeah, don't get too bogged down by the rejections. We all get rejected, and I wish that wasn't part of the process for what it sort of takes to become a writer. But it does happen, and it happens to everyone, no matter how great of a writer they are. I would also add too that in addition to publishing, you know, um, I think there's this conception that you have to pursue an MFA program in order to write. And I would want to encourage people to know that you don't, you if you take the path of pursuing an MFA program, it can support you in the process of being able to be intentional in your writing and produce a thesis that could become a book. But it doesn't mean you have to take the route of the MFA in order to become a writer. And I would want all writers to be able to know that, and that every path to writing will be different. And what will be very exciting is to see how future generations of writers take those paths up, or whatever paths they choose to take to get to where they need to go in order to write and publish. Will be very different. And there are many options to choose from. And yeah, I think that's something to just keep in mind is don't fear the process too much. Don't fear the rejections. And if the MFA is the path for you, then it is. And if it isn't, then it isn't.
Yeah, heavily noted. I'm in my third year right now, and I haven't thought about pursuing an MFA, but then, knowing that most writers do pursue one, and that definitely helps, sort of made me question whether or not I wanted to do it. But hearing that sort of established and sort of, I guess, reassurance in myself that if I really wanted to, I could just write without having to continue my education. But that's also a possibility. But yes,
Mhm.
thank you. Um, Now I want to shift our focus to the pieces itself, especially We Can't Confirm Yellow Rain Happened, We Can't Confirm It Didn't. That was the most moving piece. A lot of these pieces were really moving, but that one, I guess, stood out to me because it was a response to statements issued by 8 scholars and government officials. And I feel like the
Mhm.
integration of the statements, documents make the piece feel distant, but the response afterwards is what engages with the readers because it's an expression of how you feel. So I want to ask, what was your idea behind going back and forth between the two?
Mhm. Yeah, so that particular poem, just trying to find it in my book, that that was a poem that I knew I wanted to write for the collection and had to try to figure out how to write it. Mostly because of the fact that, like you said, there were 8 source documents that I pulled and extracted uh, some text from to serve as an epigraph. So 8 epigraphs to preface the poem is quite a bit. You rarely ever find a poem that has 8 epigraphs, but this one does. And that's rooted in the reality that there were so many documents that I came across where that was the common response, was that we don't really know if it happened. It might have happened, it might have not happened. And then to be able to then continue my research and come across more documents that were offering the same outcome. We don't know if it happened. It might have happened, but maybe it didn't happen. Um, that was just an alarming commonality that I came across. It was just happening too much as I was doing the research. And it really spoke to a kind of negligence. I feel a kind of negligence to even find out what really happened, or to make an effort to really do the due diligence that was needed in order to find out what really happened with Yellow Rain. And I think that amongst the Hmong elders, there is a version, and a version that I support, which is the idea that, yeah, something happened, and whether the government wants to real acknowledge it, whether the scientists want to acknowledge it or not, something went down there in the forests and in the jungles. And so for me to write this poem was a chance to just show my reader how many people were flip-flopping so much between what happened and what didn't happen. And stuck in the middle of all of that were the Hmong people, who were either called as liars, or who were either used as pawns to advance the agenda for developing more arms. So either, there was, on the one side, there were scientists who said, no, Hmong people are lying about Yellow Rain because it was just the bees, versus no, Hmong people were telling the truth about Yellow Rain. And because they're telling the truth, now we have to develop our arsenal. We have to spend more money on bombs to protect ourselves, because look at these Hmong people, they're getting attacked. So that was the constant back and forth political battle that was happening as Yellow Rain was also happening, and as the Hmong people were stuck in the middle of these political agendas that either were swaying one way or another. And for me, this poem is an attempt to offer the fact that the injustice rooted within how unfair it was to not have the sense of an answer. There are a couple of lines in this poem too, lines such as, perpetual chasm of in between, immortal vacillation of now and never, never there nor here, dead nor alive, accepted nor rejected, fled nor home. And those, I think in those moments, I was trying to again show the precariousness of having an answer and not having an answer, and of being just, thrown back and forth. Maybe it did happen, maybe it didn't happen. And just the carelessness, the recklessness, the negligence, and the lack of due diligence to be able to offer something that could speak to something that was more definitive, even though for a lot of Hmong elders, as I was saying, there is a sense that yes, it did happen. And for me, I think I was trying to also, I was trying to represent to the best of my ability the political battles that were happening that underscored why Yellow Rain could not be discovered, why Yellow Rain why we never found out about Yellow Rain was because of the political battles that were happening behind the scenes that were then impacting the ability of scientists to really find out what happened. So much at play there. But yeah, thank you for bringing up this poem.
Yeah, no, thank you for going in depth with your process behind that. And I want to bring up another poem, Agent Orange, Commando Lava. Also, these titles are beautifully written. I love them, and I really enjoyed this one because it was complex. The complexity in which you seamlessly weaved. I keep going back to the reports and documents, but you weave actual reports into the poems, and that was what enthralled me the most, because it made me wonder, what was the drafting process like for the poems that had reports incorporated into them?
Yeah, so to answer your question first, regarding the drafting process, a lot of the poems in this collection open up with an epigraph, right? An epigraph that I extracted or excerpted from the source document. And the epigraph is there, at the most practical level, to provide contextual information to the reader, right? It prepares the reader to understand what it is that I'm attempting to do with the poem. And it gives that, again, just that bit of historical context to ground the poem. And then there were a couple of poems like this one that you mentioned, Agent Orange, Commando Lava, in which there is no epigraph, but a lot of that lifted information that was pulled from the source text is directly implanted into the actual poem itself as part of the poem. And this one I thought was really fascinating because I pulled from multiple documents for this one. And I really wanted to look at the history of Agent Orange in Southeast Asia and its use and its impacts on not only on human health, but also on the environment and the devastation that it wreaked upon people. Upon the land, and again upon people. So for me, I wrote this one with the intention of drawing out some of that information regarding the impacts and the fallout of Agent Orange and the way that impacted the deaths that happened as a result of it. But I also looked at some other really unknown things that were happening too in Laos, such as this soil destabilization project where the government was trying to create mud so that way it could, it would hinder the trucks from being able to drive through successfully, where also the government was trying to manipulate the weather patterns in Southeast Asia and in Laos particularly, so that there was more rainfall, so that it would extend the wet season, so that you could then, hinder your enemy's ability to fight back against you. So all kinds of reasons. And I was just appalled when I found out that so much of this experimentation upon the earth, upon the planet, upon the weather, upon the dirt was happening as part of the war efforts in Southeast Asia. And that was just devastating. And so this poem is my attempt to show that as best as I can, pulling snippets of language from the source documents, but also then offering my own critique as well, on the government's experimentation of the land and of the people, and just the fallout of that. I think about that, and I think, we're still very likely experiencing the consequences in the aftermath of all these chemicals being used on the land there. And our bodies, the bodies of people there, are probably still experiencing residual consequences, whether anyone realizes it or not. And so that was my attempt with this poem, to show that if the government is capable of doing all of these various things to the environment and to the people, then they're just as capable of doing something like Yellow Rain as well. So yeah.
Yeah, that last part really, hit me really hard, because people like to trust the government. I don't want to get really political. They like to trust the government, but like you said, they are capable of these things. Just look at the horrors that they did to that, that country, the Southeast Asian countries surrounding, just to get what they want, just to, get ahead in the war and everything. But it seems as though nothing really matters as long as the outcome is in their favor. It's a favorable outcome. But yeah. And Yellow Rain has 5 compositions, and with the corresponding poems in the compositions. So I want to ask, what was the process for organizing your poems into those compositions? Because order is one thing I'm always really curious about. I'm like, well, why did you do it like this? Why did you do it like that? So what was your process behind that?
Yeah, so the compositions in the book are a moment for me and for the reader to be able to step away from the text of the poems and to then be immersed within the visual of the documents, the visuals, as much as seeing the visuals too as their own kind of text too, in some ways, as much as that's so. So for me, I think that being able to provide those compositions was a real chance to do something that was outside of the poems, and to be able to offer, as I mentioned earlier too, that because I had so much information that I had accumulated through my research, I couldn't put them all into poems per se. So there had to be other spaces that existed within the collection too, in which I could continue to offer what I came across in my research, but not necessarily need to do that in the format of a poem. And so the compositions are a way for me to do that, or at least they were my attempt to try and do that, is to offer these outside spaces, these other spaces, or these neutral spaces that were not necessarily part of the poems, but that could then offer another retelling also of the events. And the compositions, when I was working on them, I was very sort of, I was trying to think through ways that those spaces could tell their own story. And in some ways, I was pulling parts of language from different pieces of documents and figuring out their relationship to each other on that page. So if I put certain words together from different documents and applied them onto the same page, what was the effect of that? And so you can see that in some of the documents where I'm thinking through that kind of process. And I'm really intentional about what happens when the words come together on a page where you normally wouldn't see those words come together, or the kind of effect that can be achieved when you place language from different documents together to offer then a perspective or another outcome of thinking on Yellow Rain. That, I think that was my general hope with just the compositions. And also, they're a chance to breathe away from the poems, like I keep on saying, because the poems are quite a bit in there. And I really also wanted to explore the spatiality of the page with the compositions. And they gave me the chance to do that, is to really see the spaces of the page as another way of telling the story, and pulling language in was from various documents was a chance for me to retell another version too of the events. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, for sure. I really appreciate that. The language, pulling language, putting them together, taking them out. I think I don't think I've ever heard or seen anything like that before. So that's really, really, really neat. And about the poems are a lot, but I mean, that's just how it is. I guess that's what, we're given, like we were talking about with art history in particular, sort of, you keep stuff like that buried, and then the stuff that's going to come out, it's going to be even more. There's a lot to unpack. But stepping away from that now, I think I'm going to head into, I guess, like influences. So I guess you teach at the Fresno State, correct? Cool. So I want to ask, how has your experience teaching at Fresno State influenced your writing? And can you describe the literary community in your circles, such as your department, town, and in the your state in the U.S. and such?
Yeah, well, I'm from Fresno, so Fresno is my hometown, and this is where I grew up. And so I'm very fortunate to also teach in an MFA program in my hometown. So there's that natural connection that happens for me because of that. I love being able to work with students as they're thinking through their craft, as they're thinking through the assemblage of their thesis manuscripts, and as they're hoping to get published, right? And being able to support students through that process has been very rewarding for me. And I've been very lucky to work with students who are just amazing and who bring to this work, their own passion, their own curiosities, their own obsessions, and their own hopes and dreams for what they want to see out of their writing. And for me, I think that, being around that kind of positive energy, and I wouldn't even say positive energy, but maybe even just that productive energy, when it comes to creative writing and when it comes to poetry, is definitely contagious for my own book. Contagious in a good way, and in that I am, as I work with students, it really does encourage me to continually ask myself the kinds of questions that I would ask myself. I continually encouraged me to ask the kinds of questions to myself that I would ask my students about writing. And for me, working on Yellow Rain, I worked on most of that actually before I started the job at Fresno State. But when I started the job at Fresno State, I was still, doing a lot of the follow-up work for the Yellow Rain book and doing some of the editing. And it's interesting to be able to work on a project like this, and you're kind of, and sometimes when you're working on these projects, you're doing it kind of in secret, because you come back home and you're just still working away, chipping away at your poems, and meanwhile you're going to go teach class too. And so for me, it was exciting to be able to finish most of this book before I started really diving into my teaching at Fresno State. But yeah, I think that for the most part, being part of the community of Fresno State has been really rewarding, and being able to be part of the writers here in Fresno as well. One of the groups that I was very lucky to find early on in my time as a writer is the Hmong American Writers Circle. And this is a group that has helped me feel a sense of groundedness when it comes to being part of a literary community in which I feel a certain level of affinity with. And I was very happy to find this group, just because of the encouragement to publish that was promoted through a lot of the fellow group members. Everyone was talking about how to get published, and we worked on an anthology too that was also published by Heyday Books in 2011. And yeah, there was just this really encouraging vibe of workshopping poems and getting published, and workshopping and really supporting each other to get published. And I don't know that I could have seen that this was the path I would have taken if it hadn't been for this group who I found early on to be able to encourage me and help me, pursue the path and to take it seriously. Because I think a lot of times we say, okay, we'll be writers, but we'll do it as a hobby, or we'll do it on the side. And what needs to happen too for writers is that you have to then take it seriously. You have to wake up one day and say, okay, I'm really gonna make the effort to be intentional, to really pursue a career as a writer, which means I should publish, which means I should continue to write, which means I should seek out literary opportunities to do residencies or fellowships, or maybe, like you were saying earlier, if it's the MFA, then it's the MFA for certain people. So yeah, I think that community is extraordinarily important when it comes to being able to find one's path as a writer. Because again, writing is so lonely, but at least you can be lonely with other people, right? If you find a writing community that fits what you're looking for.
Yeah, no, that was beautiful. I think being lonely, but being lonely with other people definitely was a great way to put it. And you touched upon this in that your answer for that question. Being an assistant professor of English and creative writing, your works. You mentioned that you started working on it before your job there, and then you said you had to work on it in secrecy. So I guess if you wanted to explain more about your work schedule when you're writing the book, and how you made time to write, especially when like you said, the next day you had to go teach and everything.
Yeah, I think it's just a constant balance. You just have to balance it. Being a writer is being an eternal student for life. There's always going to be homework. There's always going to be something you should be working on. There's always a poem that's waiting to get written. There's always something you can go back and revise. There's always something you can send out. So the work is never ending, but it's the kind of work that keeps you going and continues to push you along in your path as a writer. You may have years where you don't write anything, and I've had moments like that too, being both a teacher, an instructor, and a professor, but then also being a poet, is that you go through months where you write nothing, or maybe you spend that time mostly reading books of poetry, or maybe you shift away from poetry at some point and you're writing a literary essay of some kind. That it's nice to have these variations in the flow of your work patterns, so that you're not constantly feeling like you have to write, you have to write, you have to write. And I think for me, that was what was helpful, was that when I started this teaching job, I had already done most of the work for Yellow Rain. I think that if I had if I had to collapse the two at the same time, it would have been extra harder, extra challenging in being able to find the time to really devote myself to these poems. And I was lucky enough to be able to have that time off before I started teaching, and that time off allowed me to really focus and dive into the book. But I think for anyone who's trying to find that balance, it's just about finding out what works for you. And I know that a lot of students ask this question of me: how do you find time to teach or to write poems if you do have to teach, if you have to make a living, if you have a family and you have to support your family? And one of the things I like to tell students is that it's okay to do your writing in smaller chunks. It's okay to take it one stanza at a time. You don't have to sit down in one sitting and write a whole entire poem. You know, you can certainly wake up and write a couple of lines, and then the next day write a few more lines. It doesn't all have to happen magically in one moment, although when it does happen, that's great. Like if it does happen in one sitting. But otherwise, you know, don't put that pressure on yourself to have to write it perfectly in that first attempt, because that, again, that can create the kind of pressure that forces you to write something that maybe is just, you know, hurried or rushed. But being able to take your time, letting your mind wander, and taking care of your emotional and mental health is really important too, I think, as a writer. It's not something we often do, is that self-care, right?
Yeah.
Which is so important in this day and age, right?
Oh, well, thank you for that beautiful message. I think you made several great points. Definitely, it was going to stick with me for a really, really long time. And I am noticing that we are nearing towards the end of our interview. So we like to end with like a really nice question. So the last question I'm going to ask you, my dear, is what does your writing space look like as of right now?
Mhm. Well, my writing space, because I'm a creature of comfort, I like to be cushioned by a lot of pillows. And yeah, I have to feel comforted and just, you know, surrounded by softness, I guess. But I write in my bed. So I'll be honest and say I like to write in my bed, and of course I just surround myself with pillows. But for me, just having a space where I feel that I can be safe in, can allow me to write the poems that are risky or a little outside of my safety zone, you know. So yeah, being cushioned is really important for me.
I think that's really interesting. Yeah, no, I can't write on my bed. It just gives me, the opportunity to just fall asleep right then and there. So I have to be sitting upright, nothing around me. But
Yeah,
yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for participating in this interview. And, thank you for giving me and the readers, really, audience, such amazing advice and, just strong messages that I know that will stick for many, many, many years. But yes, thank you so much.
thank you for these fantastic questions, Anna. Really appreciate them, and appreciate you for taking the time to read the book and to engage with my work. Yeah.
Cool. I'm going to stop the interview now. Okay.